He thought it was just an act of kindness, a ride, a warm meal. But in this small coastal town, nothing stays secret for long. She wasn't drunk. She was running from a truth powerful enough to tear the town apart. Now his home, his daughter, and the place every veteran calls safe are all in the crosshairs. They can fight for the truth or lose everything. But when powerful enemies strike back, one question remains. Will standing up for what's right cost him the only family he has left? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The wind howled like an angry beast as Ethan Cole steered his old pickup through Harbor Ridge's rain-soaked streets. The nor'easter had hit hard, turning the coastal town into a dark maze of whipping tree branches and scattered debris. His worn windshield wipers fought against the downpour, barely keeping up with the deluge. He'd just finished patching a nasty leak at First Presbyterian, where water had started dripping right above the organ. Pastor Lou had called in a panic, and Ethan couldn't say no, never could when someone needed help. His clothes were still damp from climbing around in the rafters. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the empty sidewalks. As he passed the old Veterans Hall, something caught his eye, a huddled shape against the building's brick wall. Ethan slowed down, squinting through the rain-streaked glass. There, in the yellow glow of his headlights, sat a woman slumped against the wall, her head bowed. "Lord above," he muttered, pulling over to the curb. His first thought was that she must be drunk. It wouldn't be the first time someone had wandered from the Anchor Bar down the street. But something didn't feel right. Ethan grabbed his raincoat from behind the seat and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly yanked his door from his grip as he made his way to the figure. "Ma'am," he called out, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" Up close, he could see she was wearing expensive clothes, a now-soaked blazer and skirt that spoke of business meetings, not bar hopping. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and she was shivering violently. She looked up at him with unfocused eyes, trying to form words that came out as confused mumbles. Ethan knelt beside her, his medic training kicking in as he checked her pulse. Her skin was cold and clammy. "Ma'am, I'm going to help you up, okay? We need to get you somewhere warm." His voice was firm but gentle, the same tone he'd used countless times with wounded soldiers. She didn't resist as he helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their way to his truck. The wind whipped around them, making each step a challenge. Once he had her settled in the passenger seat, Ethan cranked up the heat. "Can you tell me your address?" he asked. But she just shook her head, her teeth chattering too hard to speak clearly. Martha's Diner was the only place still open at this hour, its neon sign a beacon through the storm. Ethan headed there, knowing Martha would help without asking too many questions. The bell above the door chimed as they entered the warm diner. The scent of coffee and fresh-baked pie filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Martha looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening at the sight of them. "Good Lord, Ethan Cole, what have you found?" Martha hurried over, already grabbing clean towels from behind the counter. "Found her outside the Veterans Hall," Ethan explained, helping the woman into a booth. "She's not hurt, but she's confused and half frozen." Martha wrapped a towel around the woman's shoulders. "I'll get some hot soup and coffee. Honey, can you tell us your name?" The woman fumbled with her wet purse, hands shaking as she pulled out a wallet. Ethan caught a glimpse of the ID inside. Grace Whitlock. Martha's eyebrows shot up in recognition, but she didn't comment. Instead, she hurried to the kitchen, returning moments later with a steaming bowl of chicken soup and a large mug of coffee. "Here you go, Miss Whitlock," Martha said softly, setting the food in front of her. "This'll warm you up." Grace wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, some clarity returning to her eyes as the warmth seeped into her fingers. Thank you," she managed to say. Ethan stood back, watching as color slowly returned to her face. When she reached for her purse again, presumably for money, he shook his head. "No need," he said firmly. "Martha, you'll make sure she's okay?" Martha nodded, already pulling her phone out. "I'll call her a ride once she's warmed up. You get home to that girl of yours." Ethan headed for the door, ignoring Grace's attempted protest. The storm was still raging outside, but his thoughts were already on home, where Sophie would be sleeping soundly in her bed, probably surrounded by her paper airplanes. The drive back was slower now, the rain somehow even heavier. His headlights caught the reflection of his small rental house's windows, dark except for the porch light he'd left on. Ethan parked in his usual spot, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled. He sat there for a moment, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Sophie would be upstairs, safe and warm, unaware of the strange encounter her father had just had. With a tired sigh, Ethan grabbed his tool bag and made a dash for the porch, ready to put this odd night behind him. Morning sunlight streamed through the modest kitchen window as Ethan flipped pancakes on the well-worn griddle. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that sparkled in the early light. He'd gotten home late after dropping that woman at Martha's, and his shoulders still ached from working on the church roof. "Dad, look, there's a huge black car outside." Sophie pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. Her long brown hair was still messy from sleep, her favorite rocket ship pajamas wrinkled. Ethan turned down the heat under the pancakes and moved to join his daughter. Sure enough, a sleek black limousine had pulled up to their curb, looking completely out of place next to their weather-beaten mailbox and the patchy front lawn. "Wow," Sophie whispered, "it's like something from a movie." The back door opened, and a woman stepped out. Ethan recognized her immediately, though she looked completely different from the rain-soaked figure he'd found last night. Grace Whitlock wore a perfectly tailored cream-colored coat, her dark hair swept into an elegant twist. She carried a small silver gift bag and walked with the kind of confidence that came from years of privilege. "That's the lady from the rain," he told Sophie quietly. "She looks like a princess." Sophie bounced on her toes, smudging the window with her fingerprints. A knock at the door made them both jump. Ethan straightened his worn flannel shirt, suddenly aware of how humble their home must look to someone like Grace Whitlock. "Stay put, kiddo," he said, but Sophie was already trailing behind him as he went to answer the door. When he opened it, Grace's professional composure cracked just slightly. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice warm but controlled. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning." "Just making breakfast," Ethan replied, keeping his tone neutral. "And it's just Ethan." Grace nodded, then noticed Sophie peeking around her father's leg. Her face softened into a genuine smile. "And who might this be?" "I'm Sophie." His daughter stepped forward, social as always. "Did you really come in that amazing car?" "Sophie," Ethan warned gently, but Grace laughed. "I did, though it's just borrowed. I'm Grace." She held out her hand to Sophie, who shook it with exaggerated formality. Then Grace turned back to Ethan, her expression growing serious. "I needed to thank you properly for last night, and to apologize for the scene I caused." "No scene," Ethan said firmly. "Anyone would have helped." "But they didn't. You did." Grace shifted the gift bag in her hands. "I want to be clear. I wasn't drunk. I've never. I was unwell. I sometimes have." She paused, choosing her words carefully with a glance at Sophie. "Medical episodes." The storm triggered one. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. He'd seen enough combat veterans with similar struggles to recognize what she wasn't saying. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "Please, I insist on compensating you for your time and trouble." "No." Ethan's response was immediate and firm. "That's not necessary." "Dad helped Pastor Lou with the leaky roof, too," Sophie chimed in. "He never takes money for helping people." Grace looked between them, her carefully maintained composure softening again. "Then how can I repay your kindness? There must be something." Ethan started to refuse again, but Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, remember the library books? The ones Mrs. Henderson said were falling apart?" He gave his daughter a look that was half proud, half exasperated. Trust Sophie to think of others first. Grace seized on this opening. "The library? Is there something needed there?" "The school library," Ethan explained reluctantly. "Some of the books are pretty worn out." "Then, that's perfect," Grace said, her face lighting up. "Please, let me help with that. It would mean so much to me to be able to give something back to the community." Before Ethan could respond, she was already backing toward the limousine. "I'll return with a proper proposal. Sophie, it was lovely to meet you. Mr. Cole, Ethan, thank you again for everything." They watched as she climbed into the back of the gleaming car. Sophie waved enthusiastically as the limousine pulled away from the curb. "She really is like a princess," Sophie said, still staring after the car. "But Dad, why was she out in the rain last night?" Ethan looked down at his daughter's curious face. "Sometimes even princesses need a little help, kiddo. Now, how about those pancakes before they get cold?" The morning after the storm dawned crisp and clear, with puddles reflecting the brightening sky. Ethan pulled his old truck into the familiar parking spot outside Martha's diner, the peeling paint on the building's facade somehow more charming in the fresh light. The place had been his morning refuge since moving back to Harbor Ridge 3 years ago. The brass bell above the door announced his arrival with its familiar jingle. The aroma of fresh coffee and Martha's signature cinnamon rolls wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Most of the usual morning crowd was already settled in their regular spots. Fishermen drinking coffee before heading to the docks, retirees solving the world's problems over their morning papers. "Well, well, look who decided to play knight in shining armor last night," Bill Henderson called out from his corner booth, his weathered face creasing with amusement. The old fisherman's voice carried across the diner, making several heads turn. Ethan slid onto his usual stool at the counter, trying to ignore the grins directed his way. "Just coffee today, Martha." Martha Diaz appeared with a steaming mug before he could finish his sentence. Her salt and pepper hair was tied back in its usual neat bun, and her dark eyes held a knowing look. "Don't let these old busybodies get to you, Ethan. They're just jealous because the most exciting thing that's happened to them lately was catching a boot instead of a fish." "Hey now," protested George from his spot by the window. "That was a perfectly good boot." A round of chuckles rippled through the diner, but Ethan could feel the curiosity simmering beneath the surface. Small towns ran on gossip like cars ran on gas, and last night's events were premium fuel. "So, that was quite some fancy car that showed up at your place this morning," Tom Wilson piped up, attempting casual but failing miserably. "Black limo, wasn't it? Don't see many of those around here." Ethan focused on adding sugar to his coffee. "Just someone saying thank you. Nothing more to it." "That someone being Grace Whitlock," Martha interjected, wiping down the counter with practice strokes. "And before you all start spinning tales, she was having a rough night and needed help. End of story." "Whitlock?" Bill's bushy eyebrows shot up. "As in Whitlock Holdings? The ones buying up half the coast?" "Grace seemed nice," Martha said firmly, shooting Bill a look that could have frozen coffee. "Sometimes people surprise you, if you give them half a chance." The conversation drifted to safer topics: the weather, fishing conditions, the latest town council meeting. Ethan sipped his coffee in relative peace, though he couldn't miss the occasional whispered comment or significant look thrown his way. The morning crowd had thinned considerably when the bell chimed again around 3:30. Sophie burst in, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, clutching something in her hands. "Hi, Dad. Hi, Martha." She climbed onto the stool next to Ethan, who had returned for his afternoon coffee break. Her eyes were bright with purpose. "Hello, sweetheart." Martha smiled warmly. "Hot chocolate?" "Yes, please." Sophie carefully set a blue paper airplane on the counter. "And can I put this on your board?" Martha's community bulletin board was a patchwork of local notices, birthday cards, and children's artwork. "Of course you can, honey. What is it?" "It's a prayer," Sophie explained, sliding off her stool and heading to the corkboard. "Mom and I used to make paper airplanes when we needed extra help from heaven. This one's for Ms. Grace." The diner grew quietly attentive as Sophie pinned her creation among the fishing schedules and yard sale notices. Ethan caught a glimpse of her careful handwriting. "Please help Ms. Grace feel better." Martha appeared with Sophie's hot chocolate, topped with extra whipped cream. "That's very thoughtful of you, Sophie. I'm sure Ms. Grace would appreciate it." "Dad said she was sad last night," Sophie said, returning to her seat. "Sometimes when I'm sad, knowing someone's thinking about me helps." Ethan felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with an ache that never quite went away. Rachel would have loved seeing their daughter's heart for others growing so strong. As Sophie chatted with Martha about her day at school, the older woman slipped a flyer across the counter to Ethan. The paper was slightly crumpled, as if it had been handled many times. The bold text at the top read, "Save our Veterans Hall. Volunteers needed for repairs." Martha met his eyes. "We could use someone with your skills, Ethan. Place means a lot to this town." Ethan studied the flyer, thinking of the old building where he'd found Grace last night. The hall had hosted welcome home celebrations for 3 generations of Harbor Ridge's service members. His own father's funeral reception had been held there. Now the paint was peeling, the roof leaked, and the steps creaked ominously. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, feeling its weight against his chest. The hall had been there for them all. Maybe it was time to return the favor. The autumn sun hung low in the morning sky as Ethan balanced carefully on the Veterans Hall roof. His worn work boots gripped the weathered shingles while he examined yet another patch of water damage. Below, Sophie sat cross-legged on the curb, her sketchbook propped against her knees as she drew with intense concentration. "How's it looking up there, Dad?" Sophie called out, not looking up from her drawing. "Like Swiss cheese," Ethan replied, shaking his head at the roof's sorry state. "More holes than solid spots." He pulled a measuring tape from his tool belt and jotted down numbers in a small notepad. The sound of tires on gravel made him look up. A sleek black car, not the limousine this time, pulled into the empty parking lot. Grace Whitlock stepped out, looking different from their previous encounters. She wore dark jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. "Mr. Cole?" she called up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "I hoped I'd find you here." Sophie immediately perked up. "Hi, Miss Grace!" She waved enthusiastically, her sketchbook forgotten. "Be right down," Ethan said, carefully making his way to the ladder. He wiped his hands on his jeans before greeting her. "This is becoming a habit, Miss Whitlock." "Please, just Grace." She smiled, then grew serious as she studied the building. "I've been doing some research about the hall. Did you know my grandfather helped build it?" "Can't say I did." Ethan crossed his arms, curious where this was heading. After World War II, he worked with the returning veterans to create this place. Grace walked toward the building's entrance, running her hand along the old brick. It was supposed to be more than just a meeting spot, it was meant to be a symbol of community. Sophie had wandered over, clutching her sketchbook. "Really? That's so cool." Grace nodded, turning back to Ethan. "I saw you checking the roof. How bad is it?" "Bad enough," he admitted. "We've been patching it piece by piece, but it needs a complete replacement before winter hits." "Let me fund the repairs," Grace said firmly. "All of them." Ethan stiffened. "That's not necessary." "Please," Grace interrupted. "This isn't charity, Mr. Cole. It's about preserving something important." She pulled out a folder from her bag. "I've already contacted some local contractors for estimates. They can start next week if you approve." Sophie tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, remember what Pastor Lou always says about pride?" Ethan couldn't help but crack a smile at his daughter's wisdom. He studied Grace's face, seeing genuine sincerity in her expression. "All right," he said finally. "But the Veterans Committee needs to approve the contractors." "Of course." Grace's relief was visible. "Would you mind showing me around? I'd love to hear more about how the hall is used today." They spent the next hour walking the property. Ethan pointed out where local scouts held their meetings, where the weekly veterans support group gathered, and the small kitchen where Martha organized monthly community dinners. "My wife used to teach art classes here," Ethan said quietly, pausing in a sunlit room filled with folding chairs. "Sarah believed creativity could heal just about anything." Grace's voice was gentle. "Sophie mentioned she passed away. I'm so sorry. 3 years ago. Cancer." Ethan cleared his throat. "Sophie's paper airplane started after that, her way of sending messages to heaven, she says." "That's beautiful," Grace murmured, watching Sophie through the window as she returned to her sketching. "What about you?" Ethan asked, steering the conversation away from painful memories. "What brings a Whitlock back to Harbor Ridge?" Grace's expression clouded slightly. "Sometimes you need to face your past to figure out your future." She glanced at her watch. "I should go. The contractors will contact you directly about the roof." They walked outside where Sophie was putting the finishing touches on her drawing. "Look, Miss Grace, I drew the hall how it might look all fixed up." Grace knelt beside her, admiring the childish but detailed sketch. "You've got your mother's talent," she said softly, making Sophie beam. As Grace drove away, Ethan noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A fresh notice had been stapled to a telephone pole near the hall's entrance. White paper with bold black letters reading, "Building Permit Application." The kitchen in Ethan's small rental house filled with the rich aroma of simmering beef stew. Steam rose from the pot as he stirred, adding a pinch of salt and checking the tenderness of the carrots with a fork. At the kitchen table, Sophie frowned at her math homework, her pencil tapping against the page. "Dad, when am I ever going to use fractions in real life?" she asked, propping her chin on her hand. Ethan smiled. "Well, right now, I'm using them to make sure this stew has the right amount of seasonings. Half a teaspoon of thyme, quarter teaspoon of pepper." Sophie wrinkled her nose. "That's cooking, not math." "Math is everywhere, kiddo. Even in—" The phone's sharp ring cut through their conversation. Ethan wiped his hands on a dish towel and checked the caller ID. He didn't recognize the number. "Hello? Mr. Cole? It's Grace Whitlock." Her voice sounded strained. "I know it's late, but could I stop by? There's something important I need to discuss with you. About the Veterans Hall." Ethan glanced at the clock. 7:15 p.m. Then at Sophie, who was now doodling in the margins of her worksheet. "I've got my daughter here, and we're about to have dinner." "Please," Grace said. "I wouldn't ask if it weren't urgent." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Give us 20 minutes?" By the time Grace's car pulled up, Sophie had finished her homework and was setting the table. 3 bowls. Ethan noticed she'd automatically included one for their visitor. The doorbell chimed, and Sophie bounced to answer it before Ethan could stop her. Grace stood on the porch, looking smaller somehow in the porch light. Her usual polish was missing. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her eyes held a haunted look that reminded Ethan of that stormy night. "Hi, Miss Grace," Sophie beamed. "We're having stew. Do you like stew?" "Sophie," Ethan said gently, "Ms. Whitlock probably isn't staying for—" "Actually," Grace interrupted, "stew sounds wonderful, if it's not too much trouble." Her voice wavered slightly. They settled around the kitchen table, steam rising from their bowls. Sophie chatted about her day, seemingly oblivious to the tension between the adults. When she finally finished eating, Ethan sent her upstairs to get ready for bed. 10 minutes of reading time," he called after her. "Then lights out." Once Sophie's footsteps faded, Grace set down her spoon. "I need to explain about that night," she said quietly. "I wasn't drunk, Mr. Cole. I had a panic attack." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "I wondered about that. My father." She twisted a napkin in her hands. "He wants to demolish the Veterans Hall, turn it into luxury condos. He called me to his office that evening to sign the paperwork. I'm a major shareholder, you see. My signature is required." She drew a shaky breath. "I couldn't do it. That building means too much to this town. But saying no to my father, I've never done that before." "So you ran," Ethan said, his voice neutral. Grace nodded. "I drove around for hours in the storm, trying to calm down. When the panic attack hit, I could barely breathe. I pulled over near the hall and—" She gestured helplessly. "Well, you know the rest." Ethan got up and moved to the stove, filling a kettle with water. The familiar routine of making tea gave him time to process her words. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because my father won't give up easily. He'll use every trick in the book to get that property pressure the town council, manipulate building codes, whatever it takes." She accepted the mug of tea he offered. The hall needs defenders, Mr. Cole, people who understand its value to the community. I've seen how the veterans respect you, how people listen when you speak. I'm just a medic who fixes things, Ethan said firmly, not a politician or a businessman. You're someone who stops to help strangers in storms, Grace countered. Someone who makes extra stew without being asked. The hall needs people like you people with integrity. Thunder rumbled outside, and rain began pattering against the windows. Ethan thought about the veterans who gathered at the hall each week, sharing coffee and memories. He thought about Sophie's school concerts held in that building, the community fundraisers, the shelter it provided during bad storms. "What exactly are you asking?" he said finally. "Help me protect it. Join the preservation committee I'm forming. Your practical knowledge of the building's condition would be invaluable, and your standing in the community." "My standing?" Ethan's laugh held no humor. "I rent a small house and fix things for a living." "You serve others," Grace said quietly. "That carries more weight than you know." They moved to the porch as their conversation wound down, watching the rain fall in the glow of the porch light. Grace hugged her arms against the chill. "I know it's a lot to ask," she said, "especially from a stranger." "We're not exactly strangers anymore," Ethan replied. "Not after that night. Not after tonight." He studied her face, seeing not the polished businesswoman from the limousine, but the vulnerable woman who'd been honest enough to share her fears. "I'll think about it." Grace nodded, understanding this was as close to a yes as she would get tonight. "That's all I can ask." She stepped into the rain, hurrying to her car. Ethan watched until her taillights disappeared around the corner, the gentle drumming of rain accompanying his thoughts. A small voice spoke behind him. "Dad? Is Miss Grace okay?" He turned to find Sophie in her pajamas, another paper airplane clutched in her hand. "She will be, sweetheart. Time for bed." The late morning sun beat down on Ethan's back as he hammered another fence post into place. Old Mrs. Henderson's white picket fence had taken a beating during the storm, and he'd promised to fix it before her garden club meeting tomorrow. Sweat trickled down his neck as he aligned the boards, the rhythm of his work interrupted only by the occasional passing car. The purr of a luxury engine made him pause. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the suburban scene like dark mirrors. The car door opened with practiced smoothness, and a man in his early 60s stepped out. His tailored suit probably cost more than Ethan's truck. "Mr. Cole?" The man's voice carried the polish of boardrooms and country clubs. "Caleb Whitlock." He extended his hand, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I believe you've met my daughter Grace." Ethan wiped his palms on his jeans before shaking the offered hand. Caleb's grip was firm, deliberate. "Yes, sir. During the storm." "Ah, yes, the storm." Caleb surveyed the quiet street, hands sliding into his pockets. "I wanted to thank you personally for helping Grace that night. She can be rather emotional at times. Family trait, I'm afraid. Got it from her mother." Something in his tone made Ethan's shoulders tense. He'd heard that kind of dismissive affection before, from commanding officers who saw their men as pieces on a chessboard. "She seemed perfectly reasonable to me," Ethan said carefully, setting down his hammer. Caleb's smile widened a fraction. "Grace has always had a soft spot for lost causes. The Veterans Hall, for instance." He pulled out a business card, holding it between two manicured fingers. "Harbor Ridge is changing, Mr. Cole. Progress is inevitable. Better to be on the right side of it, wouldn't you say?" "I suppose that depends on your definition of progress, sir." A shadow passed over Caleb's features, quick as a cloud across the sun. "Indeed. Well, as a single father, I'm sure you understand the importance of stability. Making prudent choices." He paused, studying Ethan's face. "It would be a shame to get caught up in business matters that don't concern you." The threat lay there, wrapped in silk. Ethan thought of Grace's panic attack, her trembling hands in Martha's diner, and understood something about her world with sudden clarity. "Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Whitlock," Ethan said evenly. "But I should get back to work. Mrs. Henderson's expecting this fence finished today." Caleb nodded, tucking the business card away. "Of course. Family obligations come first. Give my best to your daughter. Sophie, isn't it? He turned back to his car, then added over his shoulder, Lovely age, 10. They need so much stability at that age. Ethan's hands clenched around the hammer's handle as he watched the sedan glide away. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to focus on the fence, on the simple geometry of wood and nails. But his mind kept circling back to the careful way Caleb had said Sophie's name. That evening, after finishing Mrs. Henderson's fence, Ethan drove past the Veterans Hall. His heart sank at the sight of official vehicles parked outside. 2 building inspectors in yellow vests were posting something on the main entrance. Even from his truck, he could see the bold red letters. Unsafe structure, no entry. He pulled over, watching as they photographed the building's exterior. One of them noticed him and gave a practiced shrug that said, "Just doing my job." They climbed into their municipal vehicle and drove off, leaving the hall looking somehow smaller under the setting sun. The drive home felt longer than usual. Sophie would be at Ruth and Don's until dinner, their regular Wednesday arrangement. He turned onto his street, already thinking about how to explain the hall's closure to her. She loved visiting the veterans there, listening to their stories while folding her paper airplanes. The mailbox flag was up. Ethan reached in, pulling out the usual mix of bills and flyers. Among them was a cream-colored envelope with a law firm's letterhead, Morrison Blake Associates. His stomach tightened as he tore it open, reading the carefully worded paragraphs. Dear Mr. Cole, we have been retained by Ruth and Donald Avery to discuss matters pertaining to the stability of Sophie Cole's current living situation. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. He read it again, legal phrases jumping out like accusations. Custody evaluation, best interests of the minor child, formal discussion of arrangements. Ethan stood there in his driveway, the setting sun painting everything in shades of amber, holding the letter that threatened to unravel his world. The same hand that had steadied wounded soldiers now shook as he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He could hear Mrs. Prossen's mighty A. Henderson's wind chimes next door, the distant bark of dogs, all the normal sounds of a neighborhood evening that suddenly felt anything but normal. His phone buzzed, a text from Ruth. Sophie's ready for pickup. Made her favorite mac and cheese. The message was ordinary, loving even, as if she hadn't just launched a missile at his life. As if she and Don weren't sitting in their comfortable home right now, convinced they knew what was best for his daughter. Ethan climbed back into his truck, the letter burning in his pocket like a hot coal. He had 20 minutes before he needed to pick up Sophie. 20 minutes to compose his face, to push down the anger and fear, to figure out how to hold his world together when it seemed determined to split apart at the seams. The truck's engine rumbled to life, and he pulled away from the curb. In his rearview mirror, he could see his small rental house growing smaller, the red, unsafe notice on the Veterans Hall floating in his mind like an omen. The letter in his pocket felt heavier with each passing mile. The bell above Martha's diner door chimed steadily as residents of Harbor Ridge filed in from the dark street. The familiar scent of coffee mingled with dozens of home-cooked dishes, everything from Martha's famous shepherd's pie to Mrs. Chen's vegetable lasagna. Steam rose from the casseroles arranged buffet-style along the counter, fogging up the windows against the cool evening air. Ethan stood near the entrance, helping elderly Mr. Patterson navigate the 2 steps with his walker. The diner buzzed with conversation, chairs scraping against linoleum as people made room for newcomers. Every booth was packed, with extra folding chairs crammed into the aisles. Quite a turnout, Martha said, sliding past with a fresh pot of coffee. Her gray hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and her checked apron had a smudge of flour across the pocket. When folks care about something, they show up. Grace sat in a corner booth, looking both elegant and slightly out of place in her casual sweater and jeans. She'd traded her usual heels for flats, and her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Sophie had claimed the spot next to her and was carefully folding a piece of blue paper into sharp creases. Pastor Lou stood up from his seat, tapping his water glass with a spoon. The conversations gradually quieted as people turned to face him. His weathered face carried the same calm certainty it did during Sunday sermons. "Friends," he began, his voice warm and steady, "we're here tonight because Harbor Ridge faces a challenge. Our Veterans Hall, a place that sheltered ceremonies, celebrations, and healing for over 50 years, needs our help." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several older veterans nodded solemnly. "But we're not here to complain," Pastor Lou continued. "We're here to act." After consulting with some legal minds, he nodded toward Grace. "I believe we can form a nonprofit organization to purchase and preserve the hall. Make it officially ours, protected from any future development plans." The energy in the room shifted from worried to hopeful. Martha started passing out photocopied documents, preliminary paperwork for forming a nonprofit. "We'll need a board of directors," Pastor Lou explained. "People who can represent different aspects of our community. But most importantly, we need a public face. Someone who understands both the hall's military heritage and its importance to our future." Ethan felt the room's attention shift before Pastor Lou even said his name. He instinctively straightened his shoulders, the old military bearing coming back without thought. "Ethan Cole," Pastor Lou said, "you served as a medic. You've shown leadership in crisis. You understand what that hall means to both our veterans and our children. Will you be our spokesman?" The diner fell quiet. Ethan looked at Sophie, who had paused in her paper folding to watch him with bright eyes. He thought of the red tag on the hall's door, of Caleb Whitlock's veiled threats, of the lawyer's letter sitting heavy in his pocket. "I'm not much for public speaking," he said slowly. "But that hall, it's where I first brought Sophie for daughter dances, where I learned to cope after coming home, where this whole town showed up after Sarah." He swallowed hard. "Yes, I'll do it." Applause broke out, startling him with its enthusiasm. Martha wiped her eyes with her apron corner. Grace raised her hand slightly, speaking for the first time that evening. "I can help connect us with pro bono legal services, people who specialize in historic preservation and community property rights." A few suspicious glances were cast her way, but Martha's loud, "Thank you, dear," seemed to settle any immediate doubts. The meeting shifted into practical planning. Martha organized committees for fundraising and building maintenance. Mr. Patterson offered his accounting services. Mrs. Chen volunteered to coordinate with local businesses for support. Through it all, Sophie sat quietly folding her blue paper, creasing each edge with careful precision. When she finished, she held up her latest paper airplane, covered in her neat child's handwriting. "Please keep my daddy and Miss Grace safe." She carried it to the prayer wall, a corkboard that had appeared in the diner after the storm. Other paper airplanes already hung there, carrying the hopes and wishes of the town. Sophie pinned her new one carefully among them. The meeting wrapped up as the clock neared 10. People gathered their empty casserole dishes, exchanging hugs and promises to help. Ethan found himself with a stack of business cards and a notebook full of phone numbers. Grace touched his elbow lightly as she prepared to leave. "I'll make those legal calls first thing tomorrow," she said softly. "We can do this, Ethan." He nodded, grateful for her quiet confidence. "Thank you," he replied simply. After helping Martha stack the last of the chairs, Ethan drove to the Veterans Hall. He needed to check the tarps they'd put up over the leaky sections of roof. The building's dark shape loomed against the night sky as he parked. Using his flashlight, he made a final walk around the perimeter. The red tag on the front door seemed to glow in the beam of light. Inside, generations of memories waited in the shadows. Medals in display cases, photographs on walls, the polished floor where his daughter had first learned to dance. Ethan tested the padlock one last time, its solid click echoing in the empty parking lot. Standing there in the dark, he felt the weight of both hope and dread settle across his shoulders. The whole town was counting on him now, but tomorrow's battles would be fought in boardrooms and courthouses, territory as unfamiliar to him as any foreign field. Ethan's boots crunched on frost-covered grass as he stepped out of his house early Thursday morning. The sun hadn't fully risen, painting the sky in weak watercolor grays. He pulled his jacket closer, his breath visible in the chilly air, and started toward his truck. That's when he saw them. Bright red notices covered every telephone pole along Harbor Street, their fresh staples gleaming in the dim light. His stomach dropped as he walked closer to read one. Notice of proposed development, Harbor Ridge Renewal Project. The flyer detailed plans for luxury condominiums, upscale retail spaces, and a modern community center. The Veterans Hall wasn't mentioned by name, but its location was marked as Phase 1 of the development. Below the architectural renderings in bold letters, public comment period expedited, 72 hours. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. Grace. Have you seen them? Her voice was tight with tension. Just now. 3 days isn't standard for public comment. This can't be legal. It's not. But my father's lawyers will argue it's an emergency measure due to the building's unsafe condition. He's pushing it through before we can organize any real opposition. Papers rustled in the background. Can you meet me at the diner? There's more you need to know. 20 minutes later, Ethan sat across from Grace in Martha's quietest booth. She looked like she hadn't slept, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Martha wordlessly brought them coffee, squeezing Grace's shoulder as she passed. Grace pulled out a thick folder. These are the custody papers your in-laws filed. My father's firm is representing them. Ethan's hands tightened around his coffee mug. How did you get these? I still have access to the firm's database. They're painting you as unstable, a grieving widower who's neglecting his daughter to pursue a hopeless crusade against progress. She met his eyes. They're using our friendship against you, suggesting Sophie lacks proper maternal influence. The mug's heat suddenly felt scalding. Ethan set it down carefully, his military training helping him maintain composure. Ruth and Don never approved of me, but using Sophie as a weapon. My father's signature move. He finds what matters most to people and threatens it. Grace's voice cracked. I'm so sorry, Ethan. This is my fault. If I hadn't involved you... Stop. Ethan's tone was gentle but firm. You didn't cause this. Your father did. Grace blinked rapidly, fighting tears. We should stop working together. I can find another way to fight the development. You need to focus on keeping Sophie. That's exactly what he wants. Ethan leaned forward. Listen, Sophie lost her mother. I won't let her lose her home too. This town, these people, they're her family. If we let your father destroy the hall, it's just the beginning. Soon there won't be any place left in Harbor Ridge for families like ours. But the custody case will show Sophie what it means to stand up for what's right. He smiled slightly. She's already teaching us that, with those paper airplanes of hers. Grace wiped her eyes, straightening. Then we need a plan. The expedited comment period is illegal, but challenging it will take time we don't have. We need to rally public support immediately. Pastor Lou mentioned setting up that nonprofit. Could we fast-track it? Yes. Grace pulled out her phone. I know a lawyer who owes me a favor. She specializes in community land trusts. If we can get enough pledges from residents. They spent the next hour outlining strategy, Martha quietly refilling their coffee and keeping other customers away from their corner. Finally, Grace had to leave for a conference call. At the door, she turned back. Ethan, are you sure about this? My father, he fights dirty. I survived worse in Afghanistan. He held her gaze. The question is, are you ready? He's your father. Not the father I needed. Grace's chin lifted. Maybe it's time I stopped trying to earn his approval and started earning my own. After she left, Ethan drove to the Veterans Hall. The setting sun painted the building's weathered boards in shades of amber and rose, making the red, unsafe notice seem to glow like a warning beacon. He stood on the cracked sidewalk, hands in his pockets, studying the place where he'd found Grace that stormy night. The hall had survived nor'easters, neglect, and decades of tight budgets. Its walls held memories of homecomings, wakes, wedding receptions, and countless moments of neighbors helping neighbors. Now it faced its greatest threat, not from nature or time, but from a man who saw Harbor Ridge as nothing but numbers on a spreadsheet. A cold wind rustled the notice, its edges flapping like a challenge. The choice crystallized in Ethan's mind. He could retreat, focus solely on Sophie, let Caleb Whitlock remake the town in his image. Or he could stand his ground, show his daughter that some things were worth fighting for, and trust that the same community that had helped him raise her would stand with them now. His phone buzzed, a text from Sophie. "Can we bring Mrs. Chen soup? She's sick." Even in the middle of their own troubles, his little girl thought of others first. Ethan took one last look at the hall, its windows reflecting the dying sunlight like tired but watchful eyes. The path ahead was clear, if not easy. Save this place, protect his daughter, and face down Caleb Whitlock's vision of progress with something stronger, a community's right to choose its own future. The church basement filled quickly that Saturday morning despite the early hour. Metal folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as people settled in, their breath visible in the chilly air until the ancient heating system finally sputtered to life. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the gathered crowd. Veterans in their service caps, elderly residents clutching coffee cups, and concerned citizens from all corners of Harbor Ridge. Ethan stood at the back, arms crossed, watching as Grace helped Martha set up a card table with coffee and donuts. She looked different today. Wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual business attire, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. She caught his eye and gave a small nod. Pastor Lou cleared his throat at the front of the room. "Folks, we're here today to share our stories about what the Veterans Hall means to this community. These testimonies will be recorded for the City Council meeting next week." The first to speak was Frank Miller, 82, who shuffled to the front with his cane. His VFW cap sat proudly on his white hair. "That hall," he began, voice wavering, "was where I learned to walk again after losing my leg in Korea. The boys there, they wouldn't let me give up. We've helped hundreds of vets like me over the years." Grace sat in the front row taking careful notes, but Ethan could see her fingers trembling slightly as she wrote. Next came Mrs. Henderson, who'd run the hall's food pantry for 30 years. During the recession in '08, we fed over 200 families a week from that kitchen. Rich or poor didn't matter. Everyone ate together at those tables. In the corner, Sophie had set up a small card table. She carefully folded white paper into airplanes, writing messages on the wings with colored markers. A few other children had joined her, learning her technique. The room fell silent as James Washington stood up. At 75, the retired Marine carried himself ramrod straight, his dark skin contrasting with his silver hair. 1969, he began, his deep voice filling the basement. "I came home from Vietnam to a town that didn't want me in their restaurants or their bars. But that hall? Those vets didn't care what color I was. They said I was their brother, and they meant it." He paused, removing his glasses to wipe his eyes. "I met my wife Eleanor at a dance there, raised our kids running around those halls. Now our grandkids do the same. That place taught this town what real integration looks like, long before anyone was ready to learn it." Ethan watched Grace dab at her eyes with a tissue. She'd stopped taking notes, just listening, her face showing every emotion that passed through the room. More stories poured forth. Wedding receptions, AA meetings, literacy classes, shelter during storms. Each testimony built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of community that spanned generations. The hall wasn't just a building, it was the heart of Harbor Ridge. Sophie and her young helpers had started carefully pinning their paper airplanes to a corkboard. Each one carried a prayer or hope. "Please, save our hall. Keep our veterans safe. Help us stay together." The wall of white wings grew steadily throughout the morning. An elderly woman in a purple cardigan spoke about how the hall's weekly senior lunches were her only social interaction after her husband died. "Without those meals, without that fellowship," she trailed off, unable to continue. Grace got up and brought her a glass of water, squeezing her hand gently. Pastor Lou stood again. "These are the stories we need to tell. This isn't about property values or profit margins, it's about people. Real people whose lives are woven into every brick of that building. The meeting stretched past noon. As people began to filter out, many stopped to add their own paper airplanes to Sophie's wall. The display had taken on a life of its own, spreading across the corkboard like a flock of hopes taking flight. Grace approached Ethan, her notepad full of cramped writing. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her voice was steady. "I knew it was important to people, but this." She gestured to the room, to the wall of paper prayers. "This is something else entirely." Ethan nodded, uncrossing his arms. "This is what community looks like, real community. Not something you can design in an architect's office." "I understand that now." Grace held out her hand. "Thank you for letting me be part of this, for trusting me to hear these stories." Ethan looked at her offered hand for a moment, then took it. Her grip was firm, sincere. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted, a deeper understanding, a shared purpose that went beyond their initial wary alliance. Sophie bounded up to them, her marker-stained fingers clutching another paper airplane. "Look, we made 73, that's how old the hall is." She beamed at them both, unconsciously bringing them closer together in her excitement. Around them, the basement slowly emptied, but the stories hung in the air like invisible threads, binding together all who had shared them. The wall of paper airplanes rustled softly in the draft from the heating vent, each one carrying a piece of Harbor Ridge's heart written in children's careful handwriting. The afternoon sun filtered through the half-repaired roof of the Veterans Hall, creating patches of light on the worn wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the beams as volunteers swept and cleaned, their work over the past week already showing results. The leak-stained ceiling had new panels, and fresh paint brightened the walls where water damage had been. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead as he descended from a ladder, having just finished securing another section of roof tile. His t-shirt was damp with honest work, and his hands were calloused from days of repairs. The hall was starting to feel alive again, even if it still needed plenty of work. Grace stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, checking off items from their growing to-do list. She'd traded her usual business attire for jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her father's threats hadn't stopped her from showing up every day, bringing coffee and organizing volunteers. "They're here," Grace called out, her voice carrying across the hall. The foundation representative was due any minute, and everyone had been on edge all morning. Ms. Patricia Chen from the Regional Community Development Foundation stepped through the doors right on time, her neat blazer and practical shoes, suggesting someone who knew how to balance professionalism with fieldwork. Her warm smile put everyone at ease as she shook hands with the gathered town members. "Thank you all for having me, Miss Sill," Chen said, her voice carrying natural authority. "I've reviewed your proposal extensively, and I must say I'm impressed by the community involvement." Martha hurried forward with a tray of her famous cookies, and Pastor Lou guided everyone to the folding chairs they'd arranged in a circle. Sophie, who had been helping arrange her paper airplanes on a dedicated wall, slipped into a seat next to her father. Ms. Chen took out a tablet and began scrolling through notes. "The Foundation is very interested in preservation projects that protect community spaces, especially those with historical significance." The room held its collective breath. Ethan felt Sophie's small hand slip into his. "We're prepared to offer a matching grant of $250,000, Chen announced, "conditional upon Harbor Ridge passing an anti-displacement ordinance to protect other historic properties and long-term residents." For a moment, silence filled the hall. Then Martha let out a whoop that started a cascade of cheers. Sophie jumped up and down, tugging on Ethan's arm. Grace's eyes shone with happy tears as she hugged Pastor Lou. "The ordinance will need to be drafted and passed within 6 months," Ms. Chen continued, smiling at their joy. "Our legal team can assist with the framework." The meeting transformed into an impromptu planning session. Grace's legal knowledge proved invaluable as they discussed ordinance details with Ms. Chen. Ethan watched her in her element, confidently explaining complex terms in simple language everyone could understand. As afternoon turned to evening, someone strung up lights across the hall's beams, their warm glow creating a festive atmosphere. Martha and several others brought covered dishes from home, turning the celebration into a proper Harbor Ridge gathering. The hall hummed with hope and possibility. Veterans shared stories with younger residents, children darted between groups playing tag, and even the most skeptical town members seemed caught up in the mood. Sophie's paper airplane wall had grown, covered now in prayers and wishes from the whole community. Ethan found himself by the refreshment table, pouring lemonade, when Grace appeared beside him. In the string light's glow, her eyes sparkled with something more than just victory. "I never thought we'd get this far," she said softly, accepting the cup he offered. "You made it happen," Ethan replied. "Your knowledge, your connections." "No," Grace interrupted gently. "We made it happen, all of us, together." They moved away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner near Sophie's prayer wall. Paper airplanes rustled softly above them in the evening breeze coming through the windows. "You know," Grace said, "I used to think making my father proud was the most important thing in the world." She touched one of the paper airplanes gently. "But this feels like what I was meant to do." Ethan turned to face her, struck by how natural she looked here, away from the corporate world she'd been raised in. The string lights cast a warm glow on her face, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Grace moved closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for showing me what really matters." The kiss happened naturally, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. It was gentle and brief, full of shared purpose and new understanding. When they pulled apart, Ethan saw Sophie watching from across the room, grinning widely. The celebration continued around them, but they stayed in their quiet corner a moment longer, both processing this new development. Eventually, Grace squeezed his hand and moved away to help Martha with the cleanup, while Ethan went to check on Sophie. As the evening wound down, people began heading home, full of food and optimism. Grace left first, catching Ethan's eye as she walked out. Her smile carried all the warmth of the evening with it. Ethan departed shortly after with Sophie, who was practically bouncing despite the late hour. The string lights twinkled behind them as they walked to the truck, illuminating the old hall that now held so much promise. Hope, it seemed, had finally found a home in Harbor Ridge. The shrill ring of Ethan's phone cut through the peaceful morning quiet. He reached for it, still groggy from a late night of paperwork for the hall's restoration project. Martha's name flashed on the screen. "Ethan, you need to check your email right now." Martha's voice was tight with worry. "That nasty local blog, the one that's always stirring up trouble. They've posted something about you and Grace." His stomach dropped as he opened his laptop. The blog's homepage loaded, revealing a series of grainy photos. His heart stopped. There he was with Grace, outside the courthouse, after their meeting with the pro bono lawyers. The photos showed them Huginga moment of shared relief after a small victory in their fight for the hall. But the captions beneath told a different story. Secret romance, wealthy heiress, and single father's scandalous affair. Another read. Questions raised about home environment as custody battle looms. Ethan's hands shook as he scrolled through the comments. Neighbors he'd known for years were already weighing in, some defending him, others expressing shock and disappointment. "Martha," he started. "Don't you dare apologize," she cut him off. "This is a hit job, plain and simple. But Ruth just called me in a state. She and Don are on their way to see you." As if on cue, tires crunched on his gravel driveway. Ethan looked out the window to see his in-law's car parking next to his truck. "They're here now. I'll call you back." He barely had time to pull on a shirt before Ruth burst through the front door, Don following with a thunderous expression. Sophie was still at her friend's house for a sleepover small mercies. "Have you seen what they're saying about you?" Ruth's voice cracked with emotion. She thrust her phone at him, the screen showing the same damning photos. "What were you thinking?" "Ruth, it's not what it looks like," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady. "Grace and I had just won a temporary stay on the demolition order. We were celebrating good news for the hall." "Good news?" Don's face reddened. "You're being painted as an opportunist who's sleeping with a rich woman for money. Do you have any idea what this will do to Sophie's reputation? To her stability?" The accusation hit Ethan like a physical blow. Sophie is fine. She's safe. She's loved. And she's proud of what we're doing to save the hall. Is she? Ruth's eyes welled with tears. Or is she watching her father throw away everything her mother worked for? Karen wanted her to have a normal life, not be caught up in some scandal. The mention of Karen made Ethan's chest tighten. Don't you dare use her memory against me. Everything I do is to give Sophie the life Karen would have wanted, one with values, with community. His phone buzzed again. Grace's name appeared on the screen. Is that her? Don demanded. Your wealthy girlfriend? She's not, Ethan started, but Ruth cut him off. We're filing for emergency custody review, she announced, her voice shaking. This environment isn't healthy for Sophie anymore. You're not thinking clearly. Before Ethan could respond, a soft knock at the door made them all turn. Grace stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. I never meant for any of this to happen. Ruth drew herself up, eyes flashing. Haven't you done enough damage? Mrs. Avery. Grace stepped forward, her composure remarkable, despite her obvious distress. I know how this looks, but please believe me, your granddaughter's father is one of the most honorable men I've ever met. He's fighting for something that matters, not just for Sophie, but for everyone in Harbor Ridge. Honor doesn't matter when our granddaughter's reputation is being dragged through the mud, Don growled. Grace flinched, but held her ground. The blog post is my father's doing. He's trying to discredit Ethan because he can't buy him off. I'll make a public statement. Set the record straight. Don't, Ethan said sharply. Everyone turned to look at him. That's exactly what they want to make this personal, to make it about us instead of the hall. We can't play their game. But Ethan, Grace started. He's right. Martha's voice came from the doorway. No one had heard her arrive. She stood with her arms crossed, surveying the scene. You make a statement now. It just feeds the gossip machine. But Ruth, Don, you two need to think real careful about what you're doing. You want to talk about what's best for Sophie? How about watching her daddy stand up for what's right, even when it's hard? Ruth's shoulders sagged slightly. We just want to protect her. From what? Martha asked gently. From seeing her father fight for their community? From learning that sometimes doing the right thing means people might say mean things about you? Don shifted uncomfortably. The custody hearing will show exactly what it's always shown, Martha finished firmly. That Ethan is a devoted father who puts his daughter first. Anyone who knows him knows that's true. The room fell silent. Ethan walked to his truck keys on the counter. I need some air, he said quietly. Ruth, Don, Sophie will be home at noon. You're welcome to stay and talk to her, but not about this. Not yet. He walked past Grace without meeting her eyes, though he could feel her distress radiating like heat. The morning air was cool on his face as he climbed into his truck and shut the door. His hands found the steering wheel and gripped it until his knuckles turned white, anchoring himself against the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Through the windshield, he could see Ruth and Don talking with Martha on the porch, their gestures less angry now. Grace stood apart from them, her arms wrapped around herself, looking lost. The blog's words echoed in his head, mixing with Karen's memory and Sophie's smile and everything he stood to lose. His hands tightened on the wheel as he sat alone in the cab of his truck, trying to find his center in a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows of the Veterans Hall, casting long shadows across Ethan's kitchen floor. He sat at the table, reviewing grant paperwork, while Sophie slept upstairs. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight when a distant crash of glass shattered the quiet. His military training kicked in. He grabbed his flashlight and truck keys, heart pounding as he dialed Grace's number. She answered on the first ring. I heard it too, she said, voice trembling. I was working late at the coffee shop across the street. I'm calling the police. Stay where you are. I'm 5 minutes away. Ethan's truck roared through the empty streets. As he rounded the corner, his headlights swept across the hall's front steps, illuminating scattered glass that glittered like crushed diamonds. Grace stood under the coffee shop's awning, her face pale in the streetlight. Phone pressed to her ear. They met at the hall's entrance, The heavy wooden door hung crooked on its hinges. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside, revealing destruction that made his chest tighten. Chairs lay splintered across the floor. The framed photographs that had lined the walls for decades, faces of veterans who'd called this place home, were torn and scattered. The American flag that had stood proud in the corner was ripped from its pole, trampled and stained. "Oh God," Grace whispered, her hand covering her mouth. The memorial wall. The beam settled on the wall where bronze plaques had honored the town's fallen soldiers. Several were pried loose, others damaged beyond repair. Below them, Sophie's paper airplane prayer wall was torn to shreds, her careful writing now just scattered confetti on the floor. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Officer Martinez arrived first, weapon drawn until she confirmed the building was empty. More patrol cars followed, their red and blue lights painting the street in harsh colors. This wasn't random vandalism, Martinez said, studying the systematic destruction. These people knew what they were doing, and smell that? She pointed her flashlight toward dark stains on the floor. Gasoline. Fire department's on the way, but I'd bet anything they were planning to torch it. Grace hugged herself, shivering despite the warm night. This is my father's work. He's done this before, creating accidents to push through emergency demolition orders. As if summoned by her words, a city vehicle pulled up. A man in a rumpled suit stepped out, holding official-looking papers. "I'm sorry," he said, not meeting their eyes. "Given the extensive damage and evidence of attempted arson, we have to issue an emergency demolition order. The building's not safe." Ethan's jaw clenched. "We have insurance. We can repair." "You have 24 hours to remove any salvageable items," the man interrupted, handing over the papers. "Demolition starts tomorrow evening." Grace's phone buzzed. Her face crumpled as she read the message. "The foundation just froze our grant. They're citing stability concerns with the project." More police arrived to document the destruction. Ethan and Grace moved through the wreckage like ghosts, salvaging what they could. He gathered the torn photos, handling each one with reverence. She collected Sophie's scattered paper airplanes, trying to piece together the children's prayers. Around 3 a.m., the last police car left. Ethan and Grace stood in the empty street, watching workers board up the broken windows. The hall looked wounded now, its dignity stripped away by violence and bureaucracy. "I need to go home," Grace said, her voice hollow. I can't look at it anymore." Ethan nodded, guiding her to his truck. As they drove through the sleeping town, Grace's composure finally broke. Sobs shook her body, echoing in the cab's darkness. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his own grief mixing with rage at the calculated cruelty of it all. Street lamps cast intermittent light across Grace's tear-streaked face as they headed toward her apartment. Neither spoke. The weight of their defeat filled the space between them, heavy as a tomb. The morning sun struggled to pierce through heavy clouds, casting Ethan's small kitchen in gloomy shadows. Sophie sat at the wooden table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate with her fork. The only sound was the quiet scrape of metal against ceramic and the steady drip of the coffee maker. Ethan stood at the counter, his own breakfast untouched. Dark circles rimmed his eyes after a sleepless night spent replaying the destruction at the Veterans Hall. His phone buzzed, another message from Grace. He'd been avoiding them since leaving her at the hall last night. A soft knock at the door made Sophie's head snap up. Ethan's jaw tightened as he recognized Grace's silhouette through the frosted glass. He opened the door but didn't invite her in. Grace looked as exhausted as he felt. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore no makeup. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. Sophie perked up at Grace's voice. "Miss Grace, do you want some eggs? Daddy made too many." "Sophie, finish your breakfast," Ethan said gently. "We'll be on the porch." The morning air was cool and damp. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, leaning against the porch railing. "I got a call from my father this morning." Ethan's shoulders tensed. He'd been expecting this. Grace's voice cracked. "He said he'll drop everything. The demolition order, the tabloid stories, all of it. If I just sign the development papers. She pulled a folded document from her purse with trembling hands. It's all here. One signature, and it's over. And the hall gets torn down, Ethan said flatly. I know it's terrible, but maybe. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Maybe it's better this way. No more threats. No more putting you and Sophie at risk. My father won't stop, Ethan. You saw what he did to the hall. We don't know it was him. Who else? Grace's voice rose. The timing, right after the Foundation's grant? The careful destruction of exactly what would trigger a safety violation? This is what he does. He breaks things until people give up. Through the window, Ethan could see Sophie watching them, her breakfast forgotten. She was folding a piece of paper with careful concentration. So, you're giving up? He asked quietly. I'm trying to protect you. Grace stepped closer, reaching for his hand. He pulled away. The custody threats, the rumors, that's all because of me, because I dragged you into this fight. Nobody dragged me anywhere, Ethan said. I chose to stand up for what's right. I thought you did too. Grace flinched. That's not fair. You don't know what it's like, having him control everything. My whole life, everything I care about, he finds a way to destroy it. And signing those papers will change that? Ethan's voice was hard. He'll still control you, Grace. He'll just know it works. At least, you'll be safe. Sophie will be safe. Safe? Ethan laughed without humor. What am I teaching my daughter if I back down when things get hard? If I let bullies win because fighting back is uncomfortable? This is more than uncomfortable. Grace's composure cracked. He'll take everything from you. Let him try. Ethan straightened, soldier, straight. But I can't fight both fronts, Grace. I can't protect Sophie and battle your family at the same time. Not if you're not even on our side anymore. Ethan, please. You need to go. He opened the front door. Make whatever choice you need to make, but don't expect me to pretend it's the right one. Grace stood frozen, tears rolling down her cheeks. Finally, she tucked the papers back in her purse. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so tired of being afraid. I know. Ethan's voice softened slightly, but giving in to fear never made anyone safer. She nodded once, then turned and walked to her car. Ethan watched until she drove away, then went back inside. Sophie sat at the table, a perfectly folded paper airplane in front of her. Rain had started falling, streaking down the kitchen window as she picked up another sheet of paper and began folding, her face solemn and silent. The sun was setting behind the old church steeple, casting long shadows through Pastor Lou's office windows. The room smelled of old books and coffee, with a hint of the incense used during Sunday services. Ethan sat in the worn leather chair across from Pastor Lou's desk, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the past few days. Sophie had insisted on coming with him to the church, claiming she needed to check on her prayer airplane wall. Now she sat cross-legged in the corner of the office, carefully folding another piece of paper with practiced precision. You look like you're carrying the whole town on your shoulders, son, Pastor Lou said, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug. The Vietnam veteran's kind eyes held a knowing look that made Ethan shift uncomfortably. Maybe I am, Pastor. Ethan's voice was rough with fatigue. The hall's trashed, the foundation's backed out, and now Sophie's grandparents. He trailed off, glancing at his daughter. Pastor Lou leaned forward, his chair creaking. Tell me something, Ethan. When you were a medic, did you ever hesitate to help someone because the situation looked impossible? That was different, Ethan protested. Lives were at stake. And they're not now? Pastor Lou's eyebrows rose. That hall isn't just a building. It's hope for folks who need it. Community for people who'd be alone otherwise. He paused, watching Sophie work on her paper airplane. Sometimes the most important lives we save aren't the ones bleeding on the outside. Ethan rubbed his face. I know that, but Grace. He lowered his voice. She's thinking of giving in to her father, and with Ruth and Don threatening custody? You're afraid, Pastor Lou stated simply. Of course I'm afraid. Ethan's voice rose slightly, then fell again as Sophie looked up. "I can't lose my daughter." Pastor Lou set his coffee down and reached for a worn Bible on his desk. "You know what I've noticed about fear in the Bible? It's never the end of the story. It's always the beginning of faith." He tapped the book's cover. "But here's the thing about faith, Ethan. It's not just something we believe, it's something we do." Sophie got up from her corner and walked to the desk, holding something behind her back. "What have you got there, sweetheart?" Pastor Lou asked with a gentle smile. She pulled out a perfectly folded paper airplane, white and crisp in the fading light. Without a word, she lifted her father's coffee cup and slid the plane underneath, then kissed his cheek and went back to her corner. Ethan picked up the plane with careful fingers. In Sophie's neat handwriting were the words, "Please be brave with Ms. Grace." "The real question," Pastor Lou said softly, "isn't whether you're afraid. It's whether you're going to let that fear stop you from doing what's right." Ethan stared at his daughter's words, feeling something stir in his chest, the same feeling he'd had in combat when lives depended on him pushing past his fear. He thought of Grace's face when they'd discovered the vandalized hall, the way she'd crumpled under the weight of her father's pressure. "Faith is something we do," he repeated quietly, rolling the paper airplane between his fingers. Pastor Lou nodded. "And sometimes, son, doing faith means being brave enough to trust not just God, but the people He puts in our path." The office grew darker as the sun disappeared completely, leaving them in the warm glow of the desk lamp. Outside, they could hear the distant sound of the evening bells, calling the faithful to vespers. "You know what else I've noticed?" Pastor Lou continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Grace didn't just show up here by accident that stormy night. She was drawn here, to this town, to that hall, to you and Sophie. Sometimes God's plans look like coincidences to those who aren't paying attention." Ethan's fingers traced Sophie's written plea again. The paper was smooth under his touch, like his daughter's hope was somehow tangible in its folds. "But what if?" Ethan started. "No," Pastor Lou interrupted, holding up a hand. "That's fear talking again. Faith doesn't ask, 'What if it all goes wrong?' Faith asks, 'What if God has something better planned than we can imagine?'" Sophie had started humming softly in her corner, a hymn they often sang during Sunday service. The familiar melody seemed to fill the spaces between Ethan's doubts. "When you found Grace that night," Pastor Lou said, "you didn't stop to weigh the consequences. You just helped. That's faith in action. That's who you are, Ethan. Don't let fear make you into someone else." Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the paper airplane, Sophie's words becoming clearer with each passing moment. The conviction building in his chest felt like a sunrise, warm and unstoppable. Grace's heels clicked against the hardwood floors of her downtown apartment as she paced back and forth. The setting sun painted orange streaks across the half-empty suitcase lying open on her bed. Designer clothes lay scattered around it, a mess so unlike her usual ordered world. She paused at the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Below, Harbor Ridge spread out before her, small shops closing for the day, families heading home for dinner, the Veterans Hall standing proud despite its battle scars. Her father's development plans would erase all of this, replacing warm brick and history with cold steel and glass. Her hands trembled as she picked up another blouse to pack. The thought of running away made her stomach turn. But what choice did she have? The foundation had frozen the grant. The hall was condemned. Ethan could lose Sophie, and it was all because of her family name. As she reached for her coat, something crinkled in the pocket. She pulled out a folded paper airplane, creased and worn from being carried around. Her breath caught as she carefully unfolded it. Sophie's childish handwriting spread across the page. "Dear God, please help Ms. Grace find her brave heart. She already has one, she just needs to remember." Grace sank onto the edge of her bed, the paper trembling in her hands. The prayer was dated weeks ago, from when she'd first arrived in Harbor Ridge. Before the storm, before Ethan's kindness, before she'd seen what community really meant. "Oh, Sophie," she whispered, touching the words gently. Memories flooded back Martha's warm diner on that stormy night. Ethan refusing payment for his help, seniors sharing stories about the hall, Sophie's wall of prayer airplanes growing day by day. These weren't just photo opportunities or property values. These were real people, real lives, real history. She glanced at her phone, where her father's latest message waited. "Sign the papers tomorrow, or the demolition starts." Next to it sat the custody hearing notice he'd made sure reached Ethan's in-laws. Grace stood up, her hands steady, for the first time in days. She walked to her desk and pulled out a legal pad, beginning to write. Every threat, every manipulation, every backroom deal her father had used, she documented it all. When she finished, she had pages of evidence that could stop not just the demolition but her father's entire pressure campaign. Her hand hovered over her phone. Using this information meant burning bridges that could never be rebuilt. It meant choosing Harbor Ridge over the Whitlock legacy. It meant becoming the daughter who betrayed her father. Sophie's prayer airplane sat next to her hand. "Find her brave heart," she read again. Grace picked up her phone and dialed Ethan's number. It rang 4 times before his voice, guarded and tired, answered. "Hello?" "Ethan," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'm going to testify at tomorrow's town meeting. About everything. The intimidation, the vandalism, all of it." She paused, heart pounding. "I know I hurt you by almost giving in. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything. But I could really use someone steady beside me tomorrow." The silence stretched so long she thought he'd hung up. Finally, his voice came back, softer. "You're sure about this? There's no going back." "I'm sure," she said, touching Sophie's prayer. "It's time to be brave." "The meeting's at dawn," he said. "I'll meet you outside the church at 6. "Ethan," she added quickly before he could hang up, "thank you. Not just for tomorrow, for showing me what integrity looks like." "Get some rest, Grace," he replied, but she could hear the warmth returning to his voice. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After hanging up, Grace walked back to her bedroom. She upended the suitcase, watching her escape plans scatter across the floor. Then she sat at her vanity and began preparing her testimony. Sophie's prayer airplane propped up against her mirror like a beacon of courage. Outside, the last rays of sun faded from Harbor Ridge's sky. In their place, stars began to appear, bright points of hope in the gathering dark. Grace worked through the night, fueled by coffee and conviction, until her alarm chimed at 5:30 a.m. She dressed carefully in a simple blue suit, no designer labels, no power accessories, just clean lines and honest fabric. Her hands were steady as she pulled her hair back and applied minimal makeup. In her mirror's reflection, she looked more like herself than she had in years. The streets were still dark as she drove to the church, streetlights casting pools of light on the empty sidewalks. She parked in the small lot, cut her engine, and waited. Right at 6, Ethan's truck pulled in beside her. He stepped out, thermos in hand, wearing his good jacket, the one he saved for veterans events. Their eyes met across the empty parking lot, and something settled in Grace's chest. This was right. This was true. She got out of her car, legal pad clutched to her chest, and walked toward him. They met in the middle, where the church's shadow gave way to the first hint of dawn. "You look tired," he said simply. "Didn't sleep," she admitted. He handed her his thermos. "Martha's coffee, industrial strength." Their fingers brushed as she took it, and neither pulled away too quickly. They stood together in the growing light, watching the sun begin to paint the church steeple gold. "Ready?" he asked finally. Grace took a deep breath of morning air, tasting salt from the nearby harbor and possibility on her tongue. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Together, they turned toward the church steps, united again under the brightening sky. The town hall's ancient wooden chairs creaked under the weight of what seemed like all of Harbor Ridge's residents. Bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in the stuffy chamber, with folks even standing 3 deep along the walls. The air felt thick with tension, and the faint scent of Martha's coffee, which she'd been handing out to people since dawn. Ethan sat in the front row, his work-worn hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sophie nestled between him and Ruth, who kept smoothing her cardigan with nervous fingers. Don sat rigid beside his wife, his face a mix of worry and confusion as he watched the proceedings unfold. At the front of the room, behind a simple wooden podium, Grace stood straight-backed in a modest blue dress. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on either side of the microphone, but her voice rang clear as she took the oath. "I, Grace Whitlock, swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." The town clerk nodded, and Grace took a deep breath. The room fell so quiet you could hear the old wall clock ticking. 2 months ago, my father, Caleb Whitlock, presented me with documents to sign off on the Harbor Ridge redevelopment project, Grace began. Her voice grew stronger with each word. When I refused, citing concerns about displacement and community impact, She paused, swallowing hard. He began a campaign of intimidation. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan watched as Grace's knuckles whitened on the podium, but she pressed on. First came the threats about my position in the company, then about my inheritance. When those didn't work, he hired people to create building violations at the Veterans Hall. The vandalism last week? Her voice cracked slightly. That was orchestrated by his team to trigger the demolition order. From his seat near the back, Caleb Whitlock stood up, his face flushed. "This is outrageous. I won't stand for these lies." "Mr. Whitlock," the town moderator warned, "you'll have your turn to speak. Please be seated." Grace didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. "I have here documented evidence of every threat, every manipulated inspection, every falsified report. I've already submitted copies to the State Attorney General's office." She laid the folder on the clerk's desk, then turned back to face the crowd. "But I'm not here just to expose wrongdoing. I'm here to make things right." The room collectively held its breath as Grace squared her shoulders. "Effective immediately. I am placing my personal trust shares, approximately 40% of Whitlock Holdings' Harbor Ridge properties, into a newly formed community land trust." She paused, as gasps and whispers erupted. "This trust will be managed by a local board, with guaranteed seats for veterans and seniors. The Veterans Hall will be its first protected property." Caleb shot to his feet again. "You can't do this. The board will never—" "The papers were filed this morning," Grace cut in, her voice steady. "It's already done." The foundation representative, seated with the town council, stood up. "In light of Ms. Whitlock's testimony and this new development, the foundation is pleased to reinstate our matching grant in full." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then building like a wave. Caleb Whitlock stormed down the center aisle, his face purple with rage. He paused beside Ethan's row. "This isn't over," he snarled, but his voice was lost in the growing celebration. Ruth dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while Don sat stunned, his earlier rigid posture softening. Ethan watched as his former in-laws exchanged a long look, years of worry and misunderstanding dissolving in the face of truth. Ruth touched Ethan's arm gently. "We've been wrong," she whispered, "about so many things. The custody petition. We'll withdraw it first thing tomorrow." Don nodded firmly. "You're a good father, Ethan. We see that now, clear as day." Sophie squeezed her grandparents' hands, her face beaming. A paper airplane sailed over their heads, then another, as children in the crowd began launching the prayer planes they'd brought from the church. The moderator tried to restore order, but it was useless. The crowd was on its feet, cheering, hugging, some wiping away tears. Martha's coffee cups lay forgotten as she wrapped Grace in a fierce embrace. Ethan stood slowly, his heart full, as he watched Grace make her way toward him through the celebrating crowd. When she reached him, they simply clasped hands, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if they'd done it 1,000 times before. Around them, paper airplanes soared through the air like doves of peace, carrying the hopes and prayers of Harbor Ridge toward a brighter future. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of Mayor Anderson's office, casting long shadows across the polished oak desk. The room still held the musty scent of old papers and coffee from yesterday's intense town meeting. Ethan sat in one of the worn leather chairs, his posture betraying the exhaustion of the past weeks. Grace perched in the chair beside him, her fingers absently smoothing the edge of her skirt. "Well, Mayor Anderson said, lifting a piece of paper with an official seal. "I never thought I'd be so happy to see a bureaucratic reversal." He adjusted his reading glasses and smiled. "The demolition order has been officially canceled. The building inspector will be out this afternoon to reassess the property." Grace let out a small breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ethan's shoulders visibly relaxed. "Furthermore," the mayor continued, shuffling through more papers, "I've received word that Whitlock Holdings' legal department is withdrawing all pending actions against the town and the Veterans Hall." He glanced at Grace. "Your father's lawyers sent this over at dawn." "That sounds like Dad," Grace said softly. "Quick and quiet when he knows he's lost." The mayor's office phone buzzed. His secretary's voice crackled through the speaker. "Sir, Martha's here with the volunteer coordinator list, and there are about 20 people already gathered at the hall." Ethan checked his watch. It wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. Outside the town hall, the morning air held the crisp promise of early spring. A stream of pickup trucks and cars lined the street in front of the Veterans Hall. Martha stood on the front steps, clipboard in hand, directing people like a gentle general organizing her troops. "Carpentry team with Mike over by the east wall," she called out. "Painting crew, wait for the prep work to finish. Anyone good with electrical, Pastor Lou needs you inside." Sophie darted between the volunteers, delivering bottles of water from a cooler. Her paper airplanes, rescued from the vandalism, had been carefully preserved and hung in the church windows across the street, catching the morning light. Ruth and Don emerged from their car, carrying trays of breakfast sandwiches. Ruth caught Ethan's eye and gave him a small, warm nod. The gesture carried the weight of understanding, of bridges being carefully rebuilt. "I still can't believe how many people showed up," Grace said, watching the scene unfold. She stood close to Ethan, their shoulders nearly touching. "Harbor Ridge takes care of its own," Ethan replied. "And after your testimony yesterday," he trailed off, remembering how she'd stood her ground, voice clear and strong as she detailed years of her father's manipulation. A sleek black car pulled up at the end of the street. Grace tensed, but it wasn't her father's usual driver. Instead, a woman in a crisp business suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. "Ms. Whitlock," the woman approached them. "I'm Caroline Chen from the Regional Community Foundation. After yesterday's developments, we'd like to fast-track the matching grant. I have the paperwork ready." Martha appeared at their side, as if by magic. "The diner's quiet right now. You can use my office to go over everything." Inside Martha's small office, with its walls covered in local children's artwork and faded photographs, Ms. Chen spread out the documents. The foundation's grant would match the town's fundraising efforts dollar for dollar, providing enough to not only repair the hall but also establish an endowment for its continued maintenance. "Sign here, Miss Chen indicated, "and here." She pointed to various marked lines. "The anti-displacement ordinance the town passed last night satisfies our requirements for sustainable community development." Grace's hand was steady as she signed. Ethan added his signature as the Veterans Hall Board President, a title that still felt strange to him. When they emerged from the diner, the volunteer crew had grown even larger. Someone had set up a sound system, and classic rock played softly as people worked. The harsh red tag that had marked the building as condemned was gone, replaced by a hand-painted banner reading, "Harbor Ridge Veterans Hall. Everyone welcome." "Daddy!" Sophie ran up, her face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Mike says I can help paint once they fix the walls. And Mrs. Ruth brought extra sandwiches." Ethan scooped her up in a hug, not caring about the dirt on her clothes. "That's great, sweetheart. But homework first, remember?" "Already done," Ruth called over. "She finished it at our house this morning." Don checked it. The morning wore on, full of the sounds of work and laughter. The hall's broken windows were carefully removed, frames prepared for new glass. The vandalized interior walls were patched and primed. Someone found the old sign that had hung above the entrance since 1946, and a team of artists began restoring its faded letters. Around noon, a messenger arrived with a small package addressed to Grace. Inside was a single key and a brief note in Caleb's precise handwriting. The hall's original key. It should stay in Harbor Ridge. Grace studied the brass key, worn smooth by decades of use. Without a word, she handed it to Ethan. The work continued throughout the day, but now it was time for the moment they'd been waiting for. Ethan stood before the hall's main entrance, key in hand. The crowd of volunteers gathered around, tools set down, conversations hushing. The old lock turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Ethan pushed the heavy doors open wide, and sunlight poured into the building. The freshly repaired windows caught the light, making the whole space glow with warmth and possibility. The next morning, pickup trucks lined the Veterans Hall parking lot, their beds filled with tools, paint cans, and cleaning supplies. Martha had set up a folding table outside, loaded with thermoses of hot coffee and boxes of fresh donuts. The spring air carried the scent of sawdust and hope. "All right, folks," Ethan called out to the gathered volunteers, his voice carrying across the lot. "Let's split into teams. We've got cleaning, carpentry, and painting crews." He held up a clipboard with various tasks listed. "Pick your specialty, or just jump in where needed." Grace stood among the volunteers, wearing jeans and a simple blue work shirt, a far cry from her usual business attire. She clutched a broom uncertainly, looking around at the familiar faces that had once viewed her with suspicion. "Here, dear," Martha said, coming up beside her. "You can help me clear out the kitchen first. Those vandals made quite a mess in there." Inside, broken glass crunched under their feet as they worked. Grace swept while Martha wiped down counters, sharing stories about potlucks and celebrations the hall had hosted over the years. By lunchtime, the kitchen gleamed. "You're a natural," Martha said, watching Grace organize the cleaned silverware. "Who would have thought?" Throughout the week, more volunteers arrived each day. Pastor Lou's youth group painted the walls in fresh, warm colors. Local carpenters replaced broken windows and repaired damaged door frames. The constant buzz of activity filled the building with new energy. On Wednesday afternoon, Sophie perched on a folding chair near one of the newly installed windows, carefully creasing a piece of blue paper. Grace paused from dusting shelves to watch her. "Would you like to learn?" Sophie asked, holding up her half-finished paper airplane. Grace set down her dust cloth. "I'd love to." Sophie pulled up another chair and selected a crisp sheet of white paper. "First, you fold it exactly in half," she demonstrated. "Then unfold it. That's your guideline." Grace followed along, her corporate-trained precision serving her well as she made each fold. Sophie nodded approvingly. "Now the tricky part," Sophie continued. "You have to fold the corners down just right, or it won't fly straight." They worked side by side, Sophie's small hands guiding Grace's larger ones through the steps. Other volunteers smiled as they passed by, seeing the unlikely pair absorbed in their task. "Perfect," Sophie declared when Grace completed her first plane. "Now write your prayer inside." Grace hesitated. "What should I write?" "Whatever's in your heart," Sophie said simply. "That's what Mom always told me." Grace thought for a moment, then carefully wrote, "Thank you for giving me a second chance." She showed it to Sophie, who beamed. "Now we'll test it," Sophie announced, leading Grace to the main hall where several other paper airplanes already soared from makeshift launching points. Throughout the week, the transformation continued. Old-timers told stories as they worked, sharing memories of dances, weddings, and memorial services held within these walls. Grace absorbed every word, understanding more deeply why this place mattered so much. By Friday, the major repairs were complete. The floors had been refinished, walls painted, and new curtains hung at the windows. The kitchen sparkled with organized shelves and gleaming counters. Even the ancient heating system had been coaxed back to life by a determined local mechanic. Late that afternoon, Mr. Jenkins, an elderly veteran who had served as the hall's unofficial historian, carefully unpacked a box of rescued photographs. Many frames had been damaged in the vandalism, but local craftspeople had repaired them with loving care. "This one's my favorite," he said, holding up a restored black and white photograph showing the hall's opening day in 1946. "Look at those faces. They knew they were building something that would last. Grace helped him position the frame on the freshly painted wall, making sure it hung perfectly level. They stepped back to admire it, and Mr. Jenkins patted her shoulder. "You know," he said softly, "sometimes the best way to honor history is to help write its next chapter." The photo hung straight and true on the wall, the faces of long-ago veterans seeming to smile down at their modern-day counterparts. Above it, a line of colorful paper airplanes floated on invisible currents of air, carrying prayers and hopes toward the future. Around them, the sound of hammers, friendly chatter, and occasional laughter filled the space. The scent of fresh paint mixed with the aroma of Martha's latest batch of chocolate chip cookies. Through the new windows, late afternoon sunlight streamed in, warming the polished wooden floors and illuminating decades of memories preserved in the newly restored photographs that lined the walls. The repaired frame caught that golden light, its fresh glass gleaming like a promise kept. The image within, those hopeful faces from 1946, seemed to glow with renewed purpose, watching over the community that had come together to save their legacy. The evening sun painted long shadows across the Veterans Hall steps as Ethan and Grace sat side by side, each holding a steaming cup of coffee from Martha's diner. The day's work had left them pleasantly tired, with paint specks dotting their clothes and sawdust clinging to their hair. "I never thought I'd enjoy manual labor this much," Grace said, taking a careful sip. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing small bruises from moving furniture and a bandage where she'd nicked herself with a paint scraper. Ethan smiled, watching Sophie dart across the freshly mowed lawn. "Hard work has a way of clearing your mind." He paused, studying the grain of the wooden steps they'd just refinished. "When Jenny died, I threw myself into fixing everything I could get my hands on. Leaky faucets, broken fences, squeaky doors, anything to keep moving." Grace turned to face him, her expression gentle. "How long has it been?" 4 years, 2 months, and 13 days. He let out a slow breath. "Some mornings, I still reach for her side of the bed." "Does it get easier?" Grace's voice was barely above a whisper. "Different, not easier. Sophie helps. She has Jenny's laugh." Ethan's eyes followed his daughter as she discovered the first fireflies of the season emerging in the twilight. But there are moments when the grief hits so hard, it feels like day one all over again. Grace set her coffee down and wrapped her arms around her knees. "I've been thinking about grief lately. Not just the kind that comes with death, but the kind that comes from living, too. Like watching someone you love choose anger over healing." "Your father," Ethan said quietly. She nodded. "Every time he threatened this town, every time he tried to manipulate me, it felt like losing him all over again. But maybe I never really had him to begin with." A firefly drifted between them, its gentle light pulsing like a heartbeat. Sophie's delighted squeal carried across the lawn as she chased after it. "You know what Sophie told me today?" Grace continued, smiling at the memory. "She said everyone deserves second chances, even people who forget how to be kind." She pulled a slightly crumpled paper airplane from her pocket, one of Sophie's prayers. "She's been teaching me how to fold these." Ethan reached over and carefully smoothed one of the airplane's wings. "She started making them right after Jenny died. Said if her prayers were planes, they could fly straight up to heaven." His voice caught slightly. "Your father. He might not take that second chance, Grace. Are you ready for that?" "I think so." Grace straightened her shoulders. "For the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for his approval. It hurts, but it's also freeing." She gestured to the hall behind them. "This place, these people, they've shown me what real family looks like." Ethan nodded slowly. "I've been holding back too, you know. Keeping everyone at arm's length except Sophie, telling myself it was safer that way. And now?" "Now?" He turned to face her fully. "Now I'm sitting here thinking about how sometimes the best things in life come from taking risks. From trusting again." Grace's eyes softened in the fading light. "Even after everything that happened?" "Especially after everything that happened." Ethan's hand found hers on the step between them. You stood up in that town meeting and chose what was right over what was easy. You risked everything to protect this place, these people." "Our people," Grace corrected gently. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by Sophie's laughter as she chased the growing number of fireflies. The little lights danced around her like stars come down to earth, reflecting in her eyes as she cupped her hands to catch them. "Daddy, Miss Grace, look!" Sophie called out, running toward them with her hands carefully closed. She opened them slowly to reveal a single firefly resting on her palm. Its light pulsed steadily, illuminating her delighted face. "Gentle now," Ethan reminded her softly. "I know," Sophie whispered. She watched the firefly crawl across her hand before taking flight, joining its companions in their luminous dance across the lawn. "They're like little pieces of starlight, aren't they?" Grace leaned forward, her shoulder brushing against Ethan's. "They remind me of your paper airplanes, Sophie. Little messages of hope floating in the dark." Sophie's face lit up at the comparison. "Maybe that's why God made them, to remind us that light always comes back." "When did you get so wise?" Ethan asked, reaching out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind his daughter's ear. Sophie shrugged, already turning back to the lawn. "I learned it from watching you and Miss Grace be brave." As Sophie resumed her firefly chase, Ethan felt Grace's hand squeeze his gently. The evening air had grown cooler, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and new paint. Behind them, the Veterans Hall stood strong and steady, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunset. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more moments of rebuilding, both the building and themselves. But for now, they sat together on the steps, watching Sophie dance with fireflies in the gathering dusk, their coffee growing cold, and their hearts growing warmer. The morning sun sparkled off the freshly painted white trim of the Veterans Hall. Red, white, and blue bunting draped across the restored porch railings, and a wide blue ribbon stretched across the main entrance. The new sign above the door read, "Sophie Cole Community House," in gleaming gold letters. Martha bustled around the folding chairs set up on the lawn, straightening programs with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. Veterans in pressed uniforms mingled with seniors and families, while children darted between the rows of seats. The whole town seemed to have turned out, dressed in their Sunday best, despite it being Saturday. Sophie stood at the bottom of the steps, fidgeting with the hem of her new yellow dress. She kept glancing up at the sign bearing her name, then ducking her head shyly whenever someone pointed it out. Paper airplanes decorated with prayers and good wishes hung from strings between the porch columns, gently turning in the morning breeze. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, kneeling beside her. He straightened her white hair ribbon, his hands steady despite his own nervousness. "Everyone keeps saying I'm famous now," Sophie whispered. "Billy Thompson asked for my autograph." Ethan chuckled. "Well, you're the one who showed us all how to keep faith flying." He touched one of the paper airplanes. "Sometimes the smallest hands build the biggest bridges." Grace approached, elegant in a blue sundress, carrying a small gift box. "I have something for our guest of honor," she said, handing it to Sophie. Inside was a pair of silver scissors with Sophie's name engraved on the handle. "For the ribbon?" Sophie's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Grace confirmed. "Though you might have to share the moment with your dad." Pastor Lou called everyone to their seats, his voice carrying across the morning air. The crowd settled, a sea of familiar faces, fishermen, shopkeepers, teachers, and families who had called Harbor Ridge home for generations. Ruth and Don sat in the front row, pride evident in their posture as they watched their granddaughter. Martha took the podium, adjusting her reading glasses. The diner owner's usual quick movements were replaced by a deliberate dignity as she surveyed the gathering. "When I was a girl," she began, her voice clear and strong, "my mama told me that mercy was like bread. It needed new baking every morning. Well, I've baked a lot of bread in my time, and I've seen a lot of mercy, but never so much as in these past months." She gestured to the building behind her. This place was built by veterans who came home wanting to make something good out of hard times. They could have kept it exclusive, but they opened it to everyone who needed a place to belong. That's mercy. When developers wanted to tear it down, a young woman chose her conscience over comfort. That's mercy too. Grace dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Martha continued. When a widowed father fought to protect not just his daughter's future, but everyone's children's futures, that was mercy in action. And when a little girl started folding paper airplanes with prayers inside, showing us all how to lift our hopes higher, well, that was the kind of mercy that rewrites stories. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. Someone called out, "Amen," making Sophie giggle. "Today we're not just saving a building," Martha said, her voice growing thick with emotion. "We're declaring that Harbor Ridge still believes in mercy, still believes in making room for everyone, still believes in the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things together." She paused, looking directly at Sophie. "And we're naming this place after a child because children see the truth clearest. They know that every paper airplane, every prayer, every act of kindness changes the wind's direction." Sophie Cole reminded us that hope flies on simple wings. The applause was thunderous. Sophie pressed close to Ethan's side, overwhelmed but smiling. Grace squeezed her shoulder gently. After the clapping died down, Pastor Lou led a brief prayer. Then the moment arrived. Ethan guided Sophie toward the ribbon, the silver scissors gleaming in her hands. The crowd pressed forward, cameras ready. "Together?" Sophie asked, looking up at her father. "Together," Ethan agreed, placing his hands over hers on the scissors. They stood at the threshold of the newly christened Sophie Cole Community House, ready to cut the ribbon and open a new chapter in Harbor Ridge's story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the community house lawn as people mingled around tables laden with Martha's famous potato salad, Ruth's deviled eggs, and countless covered dishes brought by townspeople. Children played tag between the chairs while their parents chatted in small groups, paper plates balanced on their laps. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the warm air. Grace stood near the refreshment table, finally feeling at ease among the people of Harbor Ridge. She wore a simple blue sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders, a far cry from her usual corporate attire. Several seniors had just finished thanking her for her help in saving their beloved gathering place, and her cheeks were still pink from their kind words. The familiar purr of a luxury car engine made her stomach tighten. She didn't need to turn around to know who had arrived. The conversations around her quieted as Caleb Whitlock's tall figure emerged from his black sedan. He wore an impeccably tailored gray suit that seemed out of place among the casual weekend wear of the townspeople. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she watched her father make his way across the lawn. His expression was unreadable, but she noticed he'd left his usual entourage of lawyers behind. That had to mean something. Grace. His voice was softer than usual as he approached, lacking its typical sharp edge. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets. She lifted her chin, standing her ground. "Dad, I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I, to be honest." He glanced around at the restored building, taking in the fresh paint and new windows. "You've done quite a job with the place." "We all did," Grace corrected gently. "The whole town came together." Caleb nodded slowly, his jaw working as if he was choosing his words carefully. "The board isn't happy about the land trust decision." "I know," Grace's voice remained steady. "But it was mine to give." "It was," he admitted, surprising her. "Your mother's shares. I sometimes forget that." He paused, studying her face. "You look like her today. She would have done something like this too." Grace blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the mention of her mother. Caleb rarely spoke of her, and never with this touch of softness in his voice. "I've been thinking," he continued, "about what you said at the town meeting, about legacy." He gestured to the building. "This isn't what I had planned for Harbor Ridge." "No," Grace agreed, "it's better." A ghost of a smile touched Caleb's lips. "Perhaps." He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture she recognized from childhood. "I'd like to propose a truce." Grace studied him carefully, looking for signs of manipulation but finding only weariness and something that might have been respect. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small brass key, holding it out to him. "We're making room for everyone," she said simply. "Even you, Dad. The senior programs meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Veterans gather on Wednesdays. Maybe you'd like to stop by sometime. See what real community development looks like." Caleb stared at the key in his palm for a long moment. Around them, the celebration continued, though Grace noticed several people watching their interaction with poorly concealed interest. Ethan stood near the steps with Sophie, ready to intervene if needed, but holding back to let Grace handle this moment her way. Finally, Caleb closed his fingers around the key. "You've grown into quite a woman, Grace." He cleared his throat. "Your mother would be proud." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked back to his car. Grace watched him go, noting how his shoulders seemed less rigid than when he'd arrived. He didn't look defeated. Caleb Whitlock would never allow himself to appear defeated, but something had shifted. The car door closed with a soft thump, and the engine purred to life. As the sedan pulled away, Grace felt a weight lift from her chest, one she'd carried for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sweet afternoon air. Martha appeared at her side, pressing a cold glass of lemonade into her hand. "You okay, honey?" Grace smiled, surprised to find the expression came easily. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "I really am." She took a sip of lemonade, letting its tart sweetness wash away the last traces of tension. The key she'd given her father was just a spare, one of many made for community access. But its symbolic weight had been real. An invitation to change, to be part of something instead of trying to control it. Looking around at the laughing children, the chatting seniors, the veterans sharing stories on the porch, Grace felt lighter than she had in years. The panic attacks that had once threatened to overwhelm her seemed distant now, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging she'd never found in boardrooms or business deals. She touched the paper airplane pendant Sophie had made her, now hanging on a simple chain around her neck. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of Martha's famous chocolate cake and the sound of someone starting up a guitar on the porch. Her father's sedan disappeared around the corner, taking with it the last shadows of her old life. Grace exhaled slowly, feeling the remaining tension leave her body. She was home. As dusk settled over Harbor Ridge, string lights twinkled to life across the community house lawn. They swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting a warm glow over the celebrating crowd. The lights formed a canopy of stars just above everyone's heads, transforming the simple grass yard into something magical. Martha had brought out her old record player, and the crackly sound of Moon River drifted through the air. Several couples already swayed together on the makeshift dance floor, really just a cleared patch of grass near the steps. Pastor Lou and his wife Ruth demonstrated an impressive waltz, while some of the seniors showed they hadn't forgotten their dancing skills from years gone by. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. He'd changed into a clean button-down shirt for the evening portion of the celebration, though he'd kept his worn jeans and work boots. His eyes found Grace across the lawn, where she sat talking with Sophie and a group of elderly veterans. The string lights caught in her hair, making it shimmer as she laughed at something one of them said. Taking a deep breath, Ethan crossed the lawn. The grass was soft under his feet, still springy from the recent rain. As he approached, Sophie spotted him first and gave him an encouraging thumbs up behind Grace's back. "Excuse me," he said, clearing his throat. The veteran smiled knowingly and found reasons to drift away. Grace looked up at him, her eyes bright in the gentle light. "Would you like to dance?" A smile spread across her face. "I'd love to." He held out his hand, and she took it, rising gracefully to her feet. Her sundress swished around her knees as they walked to the dance floor. The record had changed to something slow and sweet, Nat King Cole singing about unforgettable moments. "I should warn you," Ethan said as he carefully placed his other hand at her waist, "I'm not much of a dancer." "That's okay," Grace replied softly. "We'll keep it simple." They began to move in small circles, finding their rhythm together. Around them, other couples danced, and children weaved between the adults, playing their own games. The evening air was perfect, not too warm, not too cool, and carried the mingled scents of coffee, desserts, and Martha's famous apple pie. "I never thought we'd get here," Grace admitted, looking around at the celebrating townspeople. "When Dad showed up earlier." "I know." Ethan's hand tightened slightly on hers. "But you handled it perfectly. Making room for everyone. That was exactly right." They turned slowly, and Grace rested her head against Ethan's shoulder. He could smell the light floral scent of her shampoo. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." "Thank you for staying," he replied, "for fighting for this place, for all of us." Near the refreshment table, Sophie had gathered a group of children her age. They sat cross-legged on a checkered blanket, folding paper into careful shapes. Sophie's hands moved with practiced ease, showing the others how to make the perfect creases for their airplanes. The music changed again, this time to an old Beatles song about holding hands. More people joined the dance floor. Martha with one of the veterans' home residents, Don leading Ruth in a playful twist. The string lights swayed overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced with the couples below. "Look," Grace said softly, nodding toward the community house. The new sign caught the light. "Sophie Cole Community House," in fresh gold letters. "It's perfect, isn't it? Named for the person who never lost faith." Ethan smiled, watching his daughter. "She gets that from her mother," he said. "That unshakable belief in good things." "And from you," Grace added, squeezing his hand. "The determination to make those good things happen." They danced in comfortable silence for a while, letting the music and the happy sounds of the celebration wash over them. The evening stars had begun to appear above the string lights, adding their own sparkle to the scene. Someone had brought out more desserts, and the scent of chocolate chip cookies joined the symphony of aromas in the air. Sophie's voice rang out clear and excited. "Ready? On 3. Ethan and Grace turned to watch as Sophie and her friends stood up, paper airplanes held high. The other guests paused their conversations, smiling at the children's enthusiasm. 1, 2, 3. A dozen paper airplanes soared into the evening air, their white shapes gliding through the string lights. They carried messages of hope and thanks, prayers and wishes, dreams and promises, just as Sophie's first airplane had carried her simple prayer for Grace months ago. The sight inspired others. More children rushed to Sophie's blanket, asking for paper. Even some of the adults joined in, letting themselves be taught by the young expert. Soon the air was filled with paper airplanes, some soaring high, others doing loops, each one carrying a piece of Harbor Ridge's heart. Grace laughed as one sailed particularly close to their heads. "Your daughter," she said, "is something special." "She is," Ethan agreed, watching Sophie demonstrate another fold to an attentive audience. "Just like her mom, she knows how to bring people together." They continued their slow dance as paper airplanes glided around them. The string lights twinkled, the music played, and Harbor Ridge celebrated not just the saving of a building, but the strengthening of a community. Here, under the stars, surrounded by friends and neighbors, they had all found something worth fighting for, and something worth keeping. Sophie's clear voice rose above the music again. "Make a wish before you throw them." More airplanes took flight, carrying the hopes and dreams of Harbor Ridge into the gentle evening air. They danced in the light of the stars and strings, white wings gliding on invisible currents, while below, the town celebrated as one family, healed and whole. Morning sunlight streamed through the newly restored windows of the Sophie Cole Community House, casting long rectangles of warmth across the polished wooden floor. The air still held traces of last night's celebration, lingering sweetness of punch and cookie crumbs, the faint echo of laughter and music. Ethan walked through the quiet hall, his footsteps echoing in the peaceful morning stillness. He paused at the entrance, taking in the scene before him. Paper airplanes lay scattered everywhere like fallen leaves after an autumn storm. Some had landed in corners, others perched on windowsills, and a few had even made it as far as the stage. The front door creaked open, and Grace stepped in, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from Martha's. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a comfortable sweater, a far cry from the tailored suits she'd worn when she first arrived in Harbor Ridge. "I thought I might find you here," she said, handing him a cup. "Couldn't stay away either?" Ethan accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. "Sophie insisted we come collect her airplanes. She wants to save every single one." "Of course she does." Grace bent down to pick up the nearest paper airplane. Carefully, she unfolded its creases. "I hope the veterans always have a place to tell their stories," she read aloud, her voice soft with emotion. They moved through the hall together, gathering the paper wishes one by one. Each airplane held a different hope, a different dream for the future. Some were written in careful adult handwriting, others in the wobbly scrawl of children. "May this place always welcome everyone." Ethan read from one, smoothing out its wings. "Here's one, from Mrs. Jenkins," Grace said, holding up another. "Thank you for saving our memories." They worked their way around the room, their coffee growing cold on the reception desk. Some messages made them laugh, others brought tears to their eyes. Each one was a testament to what the hall meant to Harbor Ridge. "Look at this one," Grace said, picking up an airplane that had landed beneath the newly hung American flag. "I hope Daddy and Miss Grace keep making each other smile." She looked at Ethan with a mix of tenderness and amusement. Sophie's handwriting. Ethan felt his cheeks warm, but he didn't look away from Grace's gaze. "She's always been good at saying what needs to be said." The morning light grew stronger as they continued their collection. They found airplanes under chairs and behind the piano. Each one represented a piece of hope that had taken flight during last night's celebration. "Remember when you found me that night?" Grace asked suddenly, straightening up with a handful of paper airplanes. "Outside this building, during the storm?" Ethan nodded, remembering the rain and the worried figure huddled against the wall. "Feels like a lifetime ago." "I was so lost then," she said, running her fingers along the edge of a paper wing. "I never imagined that night would lead to." She gestured around the restored hall, at the fresh paint and clean windows, at the new sign above the door. The sound of quick footsteps on the porch interrupted them, and Sophie burst through the door, her backpack still on from spending the night at Martha's. "Did you find them all?" she asked breathlessly, her eyes bright with excitement. "Did you read them?" "We're still looking," Ethan said, watching as his daughter immediately dropped to her knees to peer under a row of chairs. "But we've found quite a collection." Sophie scrambled around the hall, checking all her favorite hiding spots where she'd launched airplanes the night before. Finally, she emerged from behind the stage curtain with a single folded plane, holding it carefully like it was made of glass instead of paper. "This is the last one," she said. "I saved it for this morning. I wanted to make it special." She handed it to Grace, who looked surprised at being chosen. With gentle fingers, Grace unfolded the airplane while Ethan and Sophie watched. Her eyes moved across the words, and her breath caught slightly. "Would you read it out loud?" Sophie asked, bouncing slightly on her toes. Grace cleared her throat and read, "Please let this be home forever." The three of them stood in a triangle of silence, the morning sun warming their shoulders through the windows. Sophie's simple wish hung in the air between them, full of everything they'd fought for, everything they'd built together. Ethan looked at his daughter's hopeful face, then at Grace's gentle eyes, and felt something settle in his chest, like the last piece of a puzzle finally finding its place. "Sophie," Grace said, her voice tender, "would you show me how to fold this one back up? I want to make sure we do it right." Sophie's face lit up. She took the paper and demonstrated her technique, the same one she'd been practicing since her mother died. "You have to be gentle with the corners," she explained, "and make sure the wings are even, or it won't fly straight." Together, they refolded the airplane, Sophie guiding Grace's hands through each step. When they finished, it was perfect crisp and ready for flight. They walked to the community bulletin board that hung in the entrance hall. It was already filling up with notices for upcoming events: veterans meetings, senior bingo nights, youth group gatherings. Sophie stood on her tiptoes and carefully pinned her last airplane at the center of the board. The paper airplane hung there, a small white symbol of everything that had changed in Harbor Ridge. Through the windows, they could see the town waking up, people heading to Martha's for breakfast, others walking their dogs past the rebuilt entrance. The morning sun caught the airplane's wings, making them glow. The evening sun painted long shadows through the windows of the Sophie Cole Community House, where the clinking of dishes and warm laughter filled the air. The monthly community dinner was in full swing, with folding tables arranged in long rows across the freshly refinished floor. Paper airplanes, now a permanent fixture, hung from strings along the ceiling beams, dancing gently in the breeze from the ceiling fans. Ethan stood by the serving table, ladling out Martha's famous clam chowder into bowls. His sleeves were rolled up, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he watched Sophie weave between tables, delivering rolls from a wicker basket. "Extra butter for you, Mr. Jenkins," Sophie said, placing 2 rolls on an elderly veteran's plate. "Just how you like them." "Thank you, sweetheart," Mr. Jenkins replied, his weathered face crinkling with affection. "You're as thoughtful as your mama was." Grace appeared at Ethan's side, carrying a fresh tray of cornbread. Her hair was tied back in a casual ponytail, and she wore a simple apron over her dress. "The Seniors Bridge Club wants to start meeting here on Thursday afternoons," she said, sliding the tray into place. "And the Veterans Choir needs the space for practice on Tuesday evenings." "We'll make it work," Ethan nodded, watching as more townspeople filed through the doors. "Maybe we can set up a calendar board in the entrance." The hall hummed with conversation and the scraping of chairs. Pastor Lou sat with a group of teenagers, listening intently as they pitched ideas for a youth mentorship program. Martha moved from table to table, topping off coffee cups and collecting empty plates with practiced efficiency. "Did you ever think it would be like this?" Grace asked softly, leaning against the serving table. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene. The walls now adorned with both old and new photographs, the restored honor roll of service members, the children's artwork displayed proudly beside historical documents. Ethan shook his head. Honestly, no, but Sophie never doubted. He gestured toward their daughter, who was now teaching Mrs. Peterson how to fold a proper paper airplane. She knew better than all of us. The Veterans Choir began gathering near the piano, their ritual signal that it was time for evening songs. Mr. Romano, who'd served in Korea, straightened his bow tie and tapped a tuning fork against his chair. "Everyone," Sophie called out, climbing onto a chair despite Ethan's concerned look. "The choir's ready." The room settled into attentive silence as the first notes of "America the Beautiful" filled the air. Grace slipped her hand into Ethan's, and he squeezed it gently. The choir's voices, some wavering with age but all sincere, rose and fell in familiar harmony. Between songs, Ruth and Don, Ethan's in-laws, approached the serving table. The past tension had melted into something softer, more understanding. "We're thinking of volunteering for the Sunday afternoon reading program," Ruth said, helping herself to coffee. "If you think there's room for us?" "There's always room," Grace replied warmly. "That's the whole point, isn't it?" The evening progressed with an easy rhythm. People moved between tables, sharing stories and plans. The town council member discussed installing a wheelchair ramp at the side entrance. A group of mothers organized a schedule for the new after-school homework club. Each conversation wove another thread into the community's fabric. As the light outside began to fade, Sophie gathered a small group of children to help collect dishes. They made a game of it, carefully stacking plates and competing to see who could carry the most napkins to the recycling bin. "Next month's dinner needs to be even bigger," Martha declared, wiping down tables. "The Morrison family's moving back to town, and Sarah's bringing her new baby." The Veterans Choir launched into their final song of the night, "God Bless America." People joined in spontaneously, voices rising from every corner of the hall. Ethan watched as Grace wrapped an arm around Sophie's shoulders, both of them swaying slightly to the music. When the last note faded, there was a moment of peaceful silence before the shuffle of departure began. Coats were collected, leftover food was divided into containers, and chairs were folded and stacked against the walls. "Don't forget," Sophie announced to the departing crowd, "next week is the first movie night. We're showing Mr. Smith Goes to Washington." Gradually, the hall emptied, though the warmth of the evening lingered. Martha was the last to leave, pressing a Tupperware of leftover cookies into Grace's hands. "For Sophie's lunch tomorrow," she winked. Ethan moved through the hall, checking windows and turning off lights, while Grace and Sophie straightened the remaining chairs. The building settled around them with familiar creaks and sighs, no longer sounds of decay, but of a well-used, well-loved space finding its rest. "Ready?" Grace asked, holding Sophie's hand as they waited by the front door. Ethan took one last look around the dimmed hall. A paper airplane caught his eye, one of Sophie's original prayers, still pinned to the bulletin board. The edges were slightly worn, but the hope it carried remained as fresh as the day she'd folded it. "Ready," he said, joining them at the door. He reached for the key, its brass surface worn smooth by generations of hands before his. The lock clicked with a solid, reassuring sound as he turned it. They stood for a moment on the porch, the evening breeze carrying the salt scent of the harbor. Through the windows, the shapes of hanging paper airplanes swayed gently in the darkness, like quiet guardians of the peace they'd all fought so hard to preserve. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you thought this was just the beginning, you're right. Click through and see where the story takes you next. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan Cole, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.